So let's look at the digestion. So you might have heard a lot about digestion. Gut health is so important. There is a lot more awareness about this, especially with ASD or autism spectrum disorders. This is tremendously important. So digestive tract is not just about absorbing nutrients, but also we know that a lot of chemicals that are responsible for the brain is produced in the gut. For example, serotonin, which is a key regulator for language, for moods, for sleep, for even cognition, is produced in the gut, 90% of it. And there is a very close relationship with our microbiome. Microbiome is something that you've probably heard like a million times now, like there's bacteria, there's yeast. In fact, we are more of these bacteria than the cells. We know from some of the studies that if the cells are just 10 trillion cells, the bacteria is 100 trillion cells. So there is so much more about microbiome that even our researchers and our doctors are so astounded to see those connections coming up, especially with autism spectrum. However, we see the digestive issues almost 3.5 times more with autism spectrum. So that's why it is so important. Now, healthy digestion is not just about the microbes. For the microbes to function better, we need the whole apparatus to work better, which means it starts from the stomach or even the gums, from the gum to the bum. So the stomach has to produce its juices, the liver has to produce its bile, the pancreas, and also the intestinal motility has to be so important for this bacteria and also for the digestion. So what does the healthy digestion look like? Usually, bowel movements of 1 to 3 times a day, easy to pass, well formed, no pain or discomfort, no blood, mucus or food, no abdominal bloating or pain. The ASD or autism spectrum children may have like perfect, no symptoms at all. You might say, oh, my child doesn't have any of the symptoms, but he does have autism spectrum. Even in those situations, we need to look at the diet. So there are numerous studies which say that there is impaired digestion, especially there is lack of enzymes in these children. And when there is lack of enzymes, it leads to something called as dysbiosis. So imagine it's a simple thing. If our stuff that we eat is not breaking down because the enzymes are insufficient or they're deficient or whatever, then it leads to bacterial and yeast overgrowth eventually, obviously. And that can cause behavioral symptoms in children. So another thing is the Clostridia and Candida. This is also so interesting because we see almost 25 times, we can say 25 species more Clostridia in autism spectrum than 0 in a neurotypical, which is a bit concerning. Because Clostridia, they produce something called as propionic acid. It's a short chain fatty acid. When they produce it excessively, it can cause symptoms. They tried to inject propionic acid to rodents, and the rodents developed autism-like symptoms, such as they started spinning, they had repetitive behaviors, they had seizures as well. So I see this Clostridia to be so prevalent with these children. And there are ways to test for Clostridia. We do something called an organic acid test. And I'll try to explain this in a bit because there's much more to all of that. Then Candida is another one, yeast overgrowth, we call it. Candida is so, again, very prevalent with these children. I often see like seasonal variations as well. For example, I have some of my patients who are in other countries where the seasons are there, like cold and autumn. They tend to have more of these prevalences, and I often get phone calls from there that the child is having symptoms. So we do see these variations as well. When I'm talking about variations, we don't know about studies of Candida causes seasonal variations, but this is just our observations. And there's a set of bacteria, which is Bacteroides and Firmicutes. These are very important, especially in anxiety, that they can cause anxiety or mood swings if it is low. So we want in good proportions. And so they are usually low with this set of population. And I have all of this taken this from the studies. For those who are keen to know where I'm getting all of this information, it's all in here. So let's look into some of the other symptoms that the child can have. Abdominal pain is very common, and because they cannot adequately convey, they can have just irritability might be there. It could be from acid reflux as well, which causes irritability. As I said, there is enzyme deficiency in these children. So fat malabsorption is very common. You might notice that the fat, when they eat it, they might burp a lot, or they might have nausea or fat in the stools. And eventually it can cause low cholesterol. And low cholesterol is so common that it can cause heavy temper in certain children, especially with autism spectrum. So I often tend to check for cholesterol because it's very important. And fatigue, they can have just mood swings and just very fatigued in general. And if that happens, then we make sure that there is good fat intake, coconut oil, things like that, and also giving more enzymes, so that helps with the absorption as well. So as I said, the abdominal pain, they can present in different ways as they cannot convey. Children tend to press their bellies to sharp edges. Oftentimes that is a sign of the pain, or they can arch their backs as well. Abdominal bloating, as you can see from this picture, this is so common. Because as I said, the enzymes are important in this. There's lack of that. Plus the motility is also impaired. So it tends to, fecal loading and bacterial overgrowth can happen. I remember a case, a child who came in who had no big autism symptoms, but it was just low growth. I mean, the child was not growing on the scale. And also he had a bit of focus issues. When we looked at it, the child had a big belly, the umbilicus protruding out. And the parents thought it was just because he's eating a lot. The child was eating a lot. And we found out that the child had something called a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is very common in children because the motility is impaired. And I'll talk about that, what is motility and how it can cause those bacterial overgrowth. And that is why, abdominal bloating is something to be not ignored. So abdominal distension, pain, constipation, diarrhea is also common, and then fecal loading. When it comes to abdominal distension, there is an important thing about this is that these children on the spectrum have low mitochondrial function or low tone, muscle tone. You might notice that they have low muscle tone in general. And our guts are actually muscular. The tube is muscular. And so if your skeletal muscle tone is low, even the muscle around the gut is low, the tone is low. And so they don't have proper motility. And that can cause the yeast to overload because the feces are not getting out of the body. And there can be, those behavioral symptoms can come in. And in those situations, we have to make sure that the mitochondria is working well. So as you can see, what I'm trying to say is there's so much of overlap of different systems in here that causes symptoms. Now, food sensitivities, this is a huge with autism spectrum because they can present in very random manner, such as, let me give you an example. I had an interesting case where the child came in for, they had autism, but he had severe sleep issues. The child did not sleep for so long. I mean, gosh, who knows, it was like rather 1 year or something. And even the family was suffering because of that. They didn't have sleep for so long. So what we did is we looked into the food intolerance because the child had already done a loads of supplements he was taking like 25 supplements or so, yet the sleep was a problem. And when we looked into the food intolerances, we removed some of those foods that he came up so high on the reports. The first time the child slept, and then the family slept. So everybody was so much relieved. So what I'm trying to say is the food sensitivities can come out in many ways. So constipation, or these children can also have symptoms such as red ears, cheeks. They can just have itchy eyes or runny nose. Constipation is there, and a whole lot of things. So definitely looking at those relevant testing may be required. So when it comes to food, food is foundational. Food is pretty much foundational because if the food and diet is not straightened up first, none of the treatments is going to hold. So whole foods diet is so important here. Lots of greens. Folate is very essential for these children because they have a lot of genetic SNPs, we call. So folate in through green leafy vegetables, spinach, broccoli, sprouts, and then B12. B12 is very crucial for children with learning difficulties, ADHD, autism spectrum. Again, genetic SNPs are huge here. And I'm not getting into much details about what genetic SNPs and how to deal with that because we don't have much time. So animal sources of B12 is pretty important in these situations. And making sure that you have soluble fibers, prebiotics, probiotics. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So diets play a very crucial role. And having a very clean diet is very crucial. Gluten and casein have shown to cause a lot of irritability in children. And this study looks at one subset of population of ASD, autism spectrum, where taking out the gluten and casein, the child had a lot of improvements. So if you are new on this journey, at least have a clean diet and a gluten and casein free to start with and see if there is improvements in that. So this is a cute slide about our microbes, which are what I talked about before. So as I said, there is so much more about these microbes now that we didn't know before. And we are now finding out that these microbes are not just in our intestines or guts, but they're also in various areas that we didn't know before, even in sterile areas in cord blood, placenta, uterus, or amniotic fluid, and all sorts of things, which is so fascinating, at least to me. And interesting thing is that the genes of these bacteria, the genes, our physiological functions depend on the genes of these bacteria. So you see, we should be thankful to our bugs because they drive the human species, not us, they drive the human species. And it's only when these are imbalanced, the yeast is overgrowing or some of these bacteria overgrow, then there are more problems. Children who tend to have frequent antibiotics, or they might have had exposure when pregnancy of the mother, that is also something to look at, where they can have long-term issues. So we can talk a lot about microbiomes in this, but we can have a separate session for that. So yeast overgrowth, you can often see the child can be non-compliant, or there might be loss of energy, hyperactivity. Toe walking is also seen. Teeth grinding often happens. Sometimes teeth grinding could be other issues like stress, or they might have parasites, things like that. Craving for bread, cookies, crackers, stimming is so common with these children, to look for yeast for sure. Laughing for no reason, super silly behaviors, and head banging. So head banging is interesting because what happens is that the brains are like in fire. Because of the yeast, the bacteria, they release toxins, and that causes heavy inflammation, and they tend to have something like fire that's going on in their brains. So we use a lot of I use a lot of herbal supports, the nutritional homeopathic as well, because that can help them push the stage they are in out of the situation, and then support with other herbal remedies as well. So yeast overgrowth, as I said, the mitochondria is so important here. They cause the bowels to stretch, and that leads to yeast and clostridium, and that can reabsorb, causing more behavioral symptoms. So giving laxatives are not going to support the bowel contractibility, because it's just going to help. It is important, it has its place, but to stimulate this bowel stretching, we need to stimulate, or we need to improve the mitochondrial function. And what causes the low mitochondria? So many zillion reasons. Toxins and nutrient deficiencies, heavy metals, all kinds of stuff. So I'm not getting into details of that. So there are nutrients that support mitochondria, and we need to work on the detox so the mitochondria is able to function better, the motility of the gut is better, and there's no yeast clostridia that's coming up so frequently. Okay, so this is important to look at.